Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Barrett Louie, and I'm part of the marketing team here at RiskIQ. Today, we'll be diving into how mapping and visualizing the web leaves advanced APTs nowhere to hide. Before we get started, a couple housekeeping notes. First, today's webinar is being recorded. Second, if you have questions during today's webinar, please put them into the questions panel in GoToWebinar. We'll answer as many questions as we can as we go. Now, let me introduce you to today's speakers. Brandon Dixon, who is RiskIQ's VP of Strategy. He's responsible for aligning RiskIQ to the market, influencing product strategy, and furthering partnerships. Next, Steffen Iwan, who leads business development at Maltego and is responsible for key accounts. And finally, Florian Murschetz. Florian is Maltego's subject matter expert who supports internal stakeholders and customers in vulnerability management, pen testing, incident handling, and IT forensics. And with that, I'll hand it over to Steffen.
Thank you so much. Also welcome from Maltego. And before we deep dive into the very cool case that Brandon will present, I would just very briefly want to give an overview of Maltego because this is also being used here. And so that the people who have never seen or heard of Maltego actually know what Maltego is. So Maltego is, as you maybe can tell from my accent, is located in Munich, Germany. And with our product, we are by now active in over 100 countries on the market since over 10 years. And we have supported over 1 million investigations since 2008. And if we look at the industries where Maltego is being used it's on the one hand in the area of law enforcement, especially if we talk about cybercrime cases. That's something where Maltego is often being used for. And then especially in cybersecurity operations for enterprises. So basically to keep your networks safe and keep all the cyber criminals out of your networks. And then also in trust and safety operations of enterprises. In very brief overview, for example, it is that if you're running a social network, that all of your people who are on that social network are not abusing your product. And that's exactly what Maltego is being used for. And if you can go one slide further, Brandon, please. Yes, I would just very quickly give an overview of what Maltego actually is. So Maltego is probably the globally best known graphical link analysis tool. And you can see that on the Maltego user interface, you can create these knowledge graphs. So what you can do is with any data sets that you have, you can pull them on that graph. You can visualize these data sets in a graphical representation. And what you then can easily do is you can identify clusters in your data set. You can see connections in your data set, and you can basically identify the needle in the haystack that you're looking for. And Brandon will show a couple of screenshots also for the case that we will look at today. And in order to give you a very brief overview of all the terminology that might be used in a later stage of this webinar, very briefly on what Maltego consists of. So I start on the left-hand side. Maltego graphs always consist of entities, and that is always a single connection or post data point on a Maltego graph. It can be an IP address, a website, a domain, etc. And in order to pull in data onto a Maltego graph, you can run so-called transforms on those entities. And these transforms can either go into OSINT data sources, such as web infrastructure, company registries, or cryptocurrencies. It can also pull in data from our partner data sources, such as from RiskIQ, but also from over 50 other data partners. And also if you're, for example, running your internal data from, for example, Splunk or your internal CM, you can pull in data from that. And with that, to the next slide, please. And Maltego actually has a lot of features built in so that your investigations can be accelerated a lot. And we will also show some of these features in a little bit. So on the left-hand side, there is something in Maltego which is called Maltego machines, where these graphs can be built up automatically quite quickly and fast. And then once you have built up these graphs, you do have several ways of going through the graphs, look at these graphs, identify clusters in these graphs, and see connections. And I think the main point, what Maltego is known for, is that you can pull in data from various data sources. So on the right-hand side, you can see that you could start with some kind of data from RiskIQ. Then you can pivot into OSINT data that's being pulled in by Maltego, and then you can go in and pull in even more data from, for example, CrowdStrike, VirusTotal, etc. And with that brief introduction to Maltego, I would hand over to Brandon in order to present the very cool case that we have today.
Thank you very much, Steffen. So thanks everybody for attending. Dropping right into the actor that we're going to be looking at today, specific APT in this case. I know, earlier this week, FireEye mentioned that they were breached potentially by a Russian actor, and want to give positive vibes to our friends over at FireEye. It's never fun to get compromised and deal with a breach, but it's certainly something that I think a lot of companies deal with. So instead of focusing on Russia, we wanted to focus on Ocean Lotus, which has been attributed back to Vietnam. And so this actor is particularly interesting. We've been tracking it for quite some time. It's been active since about 2014. Has other names going by APT 32, Sea Lotus, APT C00. And then from a target perspective, a lot of Southeast Asian nations, Vietnamese dissidents, even local Vietnamese enterprises, manufacturing sector. And then I believe they actually went after some of the coronavirus materials as well when that was kind of early in its development, specifically around the vaccine. So common phishing lures include engineering resumes, industry conferences, and more material that kind of is placed to the particular part of the world that they operate in. And so, before we kick off into the deep parts of the investigation, just wanted to briefly cover this notion of infrastructure chaining. So, what we call connecting the dots in order to build out a graph of the attacker's infrastructure. This is by and large what we do with the RiskIQ PassiveTotal product. And so how that might start is potentially with a piece of malware. And then from there, we build on top of that information, maybe looking at the IP address that it's using for command and control, if there's any SSL certificates that were ever seen hosted on that IP. If there is an SSL cert, is there a domain or another IP that overlaps, so on and so forth. And effectively, as we branch out from our original starting point, we get lower and lower efficacy as it being related. But in the first couple of layers, those can serve as pivots for an analyst to form a hypothesis about what the actor might own and kind of build out their attacker infrastructure and thus potentially block some of the attacks before they happen. And so that's kind of the premise of what we're going to be discussing today, is applying this technique over to an APT threat actor like Ocean Lotus. And so for anyone who's not registered for RiskIQ's community version, you can do so by going to community.riskiq.com. I certainly encourage you to do that, and also leverage use your corporate email address when signing up so you can get the full experience. And for anyone who registers, we immediately will drop you into a full enterprise trial where you can basically query to your heart's content, do all of the same investigations that we're doing today, and even use Maltego's community edition in conjunction with our trial to kind of do the link graph analysis as well. But for community accounts, you'll get a subset of our data once the trial expires. From our RiskIQ enterprise side, our research team continues to push things out to the community and the general public. But when we have more indicators or indicators that our research team spent considerable time doing, we'll put those behind an enterprise paywall. So that's enough of the sales bit. Let's jump into the actual investigation. So back in 2017, the good old years. 2017, I recall a blog coming out from Velexity. Shout out to Stephen Adair and his company doing incident response, helping those in civil society. They put out a blog about Ocean Lotus. It was kind of, I don't recall if it was the first public bit of information, but it was certainly some of the most comprehensive about the particular actor that I could recall. And in that investigation, there was a particular domain of mention, health-ray-id.com. It was registered, it was privacy protected, when we looked at it inside of our investigative tool, there was no passive DNS information that was helpful. There were several connections to content delivery network and ad service typo squats. And we observed a pretty extensive connection with legitimate web pages that had years of history. And the reason why I like to start here is because of how we were able to use the information that Steffen and crew put out to kind of track this particular actor and add a lot more indicators of compromise that appear to be associated with the adversary's infrastructure. So the important thing to note here is what the actors were doing were compromising legitimate web pages, putting a JavaScript snippet within the page that would then, when visited, go and build out the payload of what it is that they wanted to do inside of the user's browser. And it would do that through a combination of these typo squat domains, but also just public sources like Bitbucket, GitHub, etc. What they would do then is go to the mothership, this help-ray-id.com, in order to get some of the additional scripts as well. And what they would construct is a fingerprinting tool in order to ascertain whether or not they wanted to deliver an exploit to the client or collect more information. And that profiler or fingerprinter also dropped a cookie within the user's browser to help identify a case where it wasn't a security researcher or someone who was potentially getting fingerprinted multiple times. They wanted to ensure that their activity remained under the radar and they would only profile once. So during that investigation, we leveraged Maltego. This is not going to be the highlight of today, so I'll try to speed up my process here. But effectively, we went from that help-ray-id.com, and you can see here that's our center node using Maltego to represent this. And on the outside of all that, you see things like widget API, e-commerce, query core, misspelled Samsung, things that look like adsfly, etc. These were our secondary kind of CDN / ad provider typo squats. And using the Maltego tool, it shows the representation of how the actors actually leverage this. help-ray-id.com was effectively the main node, the centroid, if you will. And all this other infrastructure was sort of decoy in a way to proxy away from the help-ray-id.com. And then you can note on the right-hand side of this graph, the cookie that was deployed, from help-ray-id.com and the 78 other websites that were ultimately compromised, displaying that particular value. And so if we zoom out in the graph here, effectively what we did was we ran a transform and said, what are all those 78, or ended up being actually 150 compromised web pages? And this kind of gives you an indication of what a tool like Maltego is powerful in doing. If you've used PassiveTotal before and you're clicking around, you're pivoting on the different indicators, it's a great tool for discovery, but you have to sort of keep this visual aid inside of your head, whereas Maltego does that for us. So we can see in the center we have our centroid. All around the direct connections of that is the tier 2 infrastructure, meant to be like a proxy in a way to obscure the centroid. And then from that, you have a series of all these other connections which appear to be compromised web pages of some form. So it starts to give you a scale of, how popular a given set of redirectors were, how popular the centroid was, and just how large this compromise actually extended onto the broader internet. So the initial investigation results, just by pivoting around in our system and using Maltego, netted us a significant amount of indicators of compromise that was a great enhancement to the original reporting that Steve Adair's team did. And this was done in a couple of hours. This wasn't some security experts here. It was a series of pivots and automations and representation inside of Maltego, and we were able to discover what was going on very quickly. And recognizing that the actor might change because we put information out, we tried to find a way to ensure if we were going to release these indicators, could we keep tracking the actors? And the answer was yes. The cookie names that they were deploying were unique, and they did appear to continue to be ongoing. That leads us into 2018. So 2018, RiskIQ conducts threat hunting workshops. We're always looking at examples of how to teach people how to pivot, do threat hunting inside of our system and using any data for that matter. And we were conducting a threat hunting workshop at a large cloud storage company. And I recall distinctly, excuse me, looking at this infrastructure as an example and being pleasantly surprised that there was new infrastructure that was getting registered despite the fact that we put all these indicators out. So over a weekend, our analysts basically went, pivoted on some of this new infrastructure and identified that there was tons of other stuff that had been registered. There were changes to the delivery method. There was new phishing techniques and new websites that they were generating. And what we did there was we effectively blogged about the infrastructure again, burning all of that hard work that the actors had did to stand up their infrastructure. And, again, we kept a signature out there in order to track these guys as they continue to move forward. But by and large, what we noticed after this particular event was a substantial amount of change from the threat actor. And that's always the balance that you have to create here. So that takes us into 2020. 2019, I'm sure we had some visibility, but 2020 is really when some of this kind of came back to light. And that's what we're going to really talk about today. So through a series of just our own investigations, working with partners, looking out of like open source intelligence, our RiskIQ research team had surfaced an SSL certificate that appeared to be uniquely used by the Ocean Lotus actors. And the certificate itself, ironically enough, had dated back to 2017, but for some reason we didn't actually see that. And it was a single correlation point that really connected almost 1,500 IOCs from RiskIQ's Internet Intelligence Graph and really told a story about this threat actor. It was an opportunity to kind of burn all their infrastructure again. And so we ultimately put out an article, but let's dive into how we actually did the investigation. So it started with this SSL certificate. You can see on the left-hand side, we have our unique SHA-1, and then we have a certificate that is just self-signed. It's generated, and it has a common name of localhost, which is not really helpful from an analytical perspective. And then it has a negative serial number, which we actually found to be valid, but it's a pretty low frequently occurring item. In other words, of the petabytes of information that RiskIQ's collected over the past 10 years, we don't often see negative serial numbers. That's not to imply that they're all bad, but there's something bizarre about that. So that obviously had us kind of paying attention a little bit more. The time frame itself sort of matched the actors' time frame of when they were using certificates in some ways. One thing that's worth noting is in the previous investigations in 2017 and 2018, the actors appeared to leverage Let's Encrypt for most of their SSL communication comms. We didn't really come across these self-signed certs. Well, on the right-hand side is where we start to dive into the infrastructure. So here there's a listing of about 73, I believe, IP addresses in which through scanning the internet and a bunch of other collection methods, we identified this certificate being present on 73 unique IP addresses. Now, when you think about a self-signed cert, sometimes it's part of a deployment, sometimes it's part of a back-end kind of system. They're pretty common. But what we noticed in this particular certificate is 73 IP addresses is not that common. It implies that, or that low frequency implies that there's something worth looking into here. And a lot of this infrastructure, as we started to investigate it, tied back to Ocean Lotus. And so triaging the data in Maltego, normally I would run a live demonstration, but for the sake of just getting everything, kind of squared away in the slides, we're going to do it here. But these are all screenshots from Maltego. We start with the SSL certificate, and we run a transform to get all the IP addresses associated with it. From there, we build out all of the passive DNS that's associated with those IPs. So we can start to plot the domain names, the IPs, and the single SSL certificate you can see in the middle. So the green dot there is the SSL certificate, the orange dots are the IP addresses, and the blue dots are domains. So you can see here, within just 2 quick pivots that can be completely automated, we have a pretty substantial amount of infrastructure that we need to review and start to understand Is this all related to the actor? Is some of it related to the actor? What more should we be probing into as an analyst? And so when we start to dive into the domains that came back from the IP addresses, we start to notice a pattern here in some of the subdomains or some of the registered domains. And you can see in the red circles that we've highlighted here, just some of that information. And in this particular case, what we came to find out was the actor was using an encoding method where the domain would carry an encoded set of information about the victim or about the target. And that's what you're seeing represented here in this kind of seemingly random characters. And so using Maltego again, we were able to kind of validate that the domains themselves did appear to be tied to Ocean Lotus, both past and present infrastructure. The SSL certificate did appear to be valid and continue to be used. And in fact, it appeared to be leveraged by the Windows implant that they had. So rather than using the SSL certificates to have a secure communication, maybe for the websites they were compromising and injecting a script in, that made sense for Let's Encrypt. The self-signed certificate was something where, from what we could tell, the actor had automated the deployment of their infrastructure, and the implants or the victims were phoning back to that implant infrastructure. And so what the actors would do is they essentially automated the deployment of their command and control point for accessing the victim and used the self-signed certificate as part of that. And they just never changed it out. So as a result, in 73 instances of deploying and spinning up, spinning down this infrastructure, RiskIQ was able to see that relationship and form the correlation. Anyway, using the power of Maltego, we went one step further and asked for any malware that was associated with the infrastructure in order to help us kind of cluster certain activity or just further validate our hypothesis. So the malware in this particular case, the extension of the graph, is the the red dots here, and you can see down in the bottom a series of clusters. And just as an analyst, again, the power of Maltego here is these are all individual indicators of compromise. I can certainly go export all these out and block them, but more importantly, this visual view gives me an indication of seeing a lot of malware associated with one domain, or a lot of malware associated with just a small portion of the graph as opposed to the greater part of the graph up here. And what that tells me is, that tells me that where I might want to focus my efforts is taking a look at these domains first, since I do have malware that I can actually go and reference in more detail. I can look at the payload, I can understand the relationship to these domains, and thus infer what the relationship might be in the other domains where we don't have malware. And so this is just an example here of pivoting over to hybrid analysis, another partner of ours with CrowdStrike, and looking at the lure that was sent. So if our, from a research perspective, being able to have this document to detonate it automatically, see the processes that show up, and see here the network infrastructure, the DNS requests that go out, is incredibly helpful. And it just makes it easier for us to build out a more complete story as to what the actors were doing. And so I'm going to pass over to just the Maltego team because, as part of this particular exercise, we went through and did a lot of pivoting within the RiskIQ platform and the Maltego platform. But they want to cover just the idea of how to automate things further within Maltego so that the notion of pivoting isn't manually done at all. You can start with a single indicator and really spread that out and get maximum automation benefit. So Florian, I'm going to pass this over to you and just let me know when you want to start the video.
Yeah, let's start. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Yeah, in the video, you can see I will use for this walkthrough the PassiveTotal transforms by RiskIQ, which was recently updated. And you can find the new icon on there from RiskIQ. what I was doing here is to paste in the domain name, which you can see in the previous slide from Brandon, and I will paste it in there, and it will recognize this phrase. So the next thing is I need to transform it to a domain so that Maltego will recognize it as a domain directly. So the next point is to start the machine, which I was creating for this demo. And from there, I will gather information from different sources, mostly from RiskIQ, and enrich just the domain name with the information I can get easily. And this thing is it's really nice to have it with the machine to automate this task, because you need to do it every time when you have an investigation and get a easy rapid response information about a domain or something else. So as you can see here, I get the domain name, which the top level domain, and the domain, and who is information about this domain, and also the IP addresses. In this view, you can go through and look for telephone numbers, username, and not usernames, but email addresses, or so on. So as you can see, it's really nice how the graph explored. And this one was the block mode, and I now switch over to the circle mode, where you can see the clusters, which Brandon was also explaining. And in the middle, you can see one interesting cluster. So you have the domain, the IP addresses, and those are related to the winword.exe, which was in the hybrid analysis also. And as you can see there, it's correlated with the vhash from VirusTotal. So I get the information from VirusTotal about those malware samples, and they are correlated with their algorithm to map each other. So you have really in a short time the information about the IP addresses and the correlation to them. As you can see there, I also get information from Shodan about services which are running currently or in their database are about this IP addresses. So you don't need to explore your IP address. You can use the one from RiskIQ, which will be also in there to pivot over the services from an IP address, and later in the transforms. And also you can go through all those indications, for example, like this location here, and different malware samples which are related to the IP addresses or the domains. So it's really nice to have it automated, because you can focus on different types later, and don't need to spend the time during the clicking the right button and doing the investigations automated. So yeah, as you can see here, I also get that information about the autonomous system number and the company details which belong to the autonomous system number. And yeah, that's the main focus for this one. Also, I wanted to show you that you can go through different transforms which are there, and different machines. As you can see there, for example, there's the IP Explorer, which is a PassiveTotal RiskIQ machine, where you can get the information about the IP address directly from the IP address and pivot afterwards to it, get OSINT data, and so on. So yeah, cool. I will show you just short how it will work with the machines. Here you can see on the left side, it's just the macro which run the transforms, and you just need to put in the transforms which you run on the type of the entity, and you can click it by yourself. It's really easy to create such machines and automate your investigation. So yeah. Also, what you can do is to change the entity type. So in this example, I changed from the entity visualization to the ball visualization, which can also be a benefit if you set the weighting of the incomes and outcomes of the relation between different entities. So if you can see here, some some balls are getting bigger and some are really small. So the bigger ones are that having multiple inputs or outputs. So that's the weight of the entity in this graph. And it's really useful in some investigations or in further investigations to spot some interesting spots. And yeah. Now I changed it to the organic mode. In this case, it does not bring you further, but it's look really nice to see the bubbles moving over the screen. So yeah, that's it from Maltego. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I know it's probably a lot to consume, but the the power of Maltego really is, I mean, it's just great to be able to visualize the data and kind of carve it up in all different ways, as shown in that demo. Our team makes extensive use of it, and what I love about the product is similar to PassiveTotal, it's reasonably priced. So when you're an analyst shop and you have to make decisions about what you want to use, it's almost a no-brainer to kind of bring the tool in, just because of how powerful it can be in augmenting your investigations. So I didn't have a slide here that wrapped up kind of all the indicators that we found, but if you go into community.riskiq.com and type in Ocean Lotus, you'll see the publication that we ultimately put out with a series of indicators that you can reference and use for blocking purposes. But about the same time that we were conducting our investigation, we had a journalist reach out to us who had also stumbled upon some of the same components that we did, and they viewed it from a different perspective. So it was a German publication, and they were looking at cases where Ocean Lotus was kind of targeting certain dissidents within Germany, and I think that's what caught their interest. And so ultimately, they put out an article. I would encourage folks to read, and just kind of do a quick search for that. It's the screenshot on the right-hand side, and we put an article out, I think shortly thereafter, just covering some of what it is that we found. And so one of the things I like to point out in these sorts of things is, well, my nature as an analyst by trade, now running strategy and doing different things in the business, these sort of things like the tools that you saw today, both community for RiskIQ and community on the Maltego side, they're both something that is very easily approachable. You don't have to be an expert to start this process. And so I put some links here to register for the community version of our product that comes with an API key, and the community version of Maltego, which you can put our API key in, similar to Florian's demo, install our transforms and get them up and running. And if you want a starting point, this is the SHA-1 hash of the SSL certificate, and you can effectively do the same investigation that we did. Keeping in mind like the trial, you'd have to be enrolled in an active trial, but you can see the same information that we saw. You can run pivots, and in fact, because the internet is ever changing, I would almost guarantee that there's going to be new infrastructure that we've not seen, and that it's going to continue to grow over time. Just because I know that the Ocean Lotus actors like to watch and read about themselves, give me a shout out. I'm here. Talk to me. On that note, we'll take questions.
Thanks, Brandon. We've received a ton of questions throughout, so let's see how many we can get through. First one for entire panel. Which other data sources can be used to enhance this investigation?
Well, I won't speak for Maltego, but I'll say from other data sources, RiskIQ's host pairs were interesting and really helpful. The cookies in this case weren't the highlight, but as you saw in the past, that was helpful. And what I think you saw in the Maltego demo, though a little quickly, is that the transforms that they offer are from 50 other partners that are in that ecosystem as well. And I believe Florian's demo included, VirusTotal and Shodan. So really, you can leverage anything from an enrichment perspective within Maltego. Florian or Steffen, I don't know if you have any other specific data sets that you thought could be relevant, or other other data sets that you've seen leveraged in investigations, but I'll let you kind of answer there.
Yeah, I think the ones that you mentioned were already very good. One I would like to add, I think it's MISP. So Maltego also integrates into MISP, and so you can include any MISP instance, also any kind of public ones. So I think that would also be a very good one. Florian, are there any further that you think are relevant?
No, I also think about this one, because then you have to not to explore your IOCs to the public and have your own database and can search in there. Because if you are currently investigating or your team is investigating, then it's nice to have your own infrastructure and connect it directly to Maltego.
Got it. Thanks, guys. Next question. Are these techniques something that can be applied to any actor?
I'll take this one first. The answer, yes. So we've applied this to multiple actors before. Sometimes it varies on how easy it is to identify the actors. I know that, well, the reality is, like, government, entities conducting these operations, like, there's not always a good reason for what it is that they're doing, or sometimes, it's poor in how they go about doing it. However, it's just the state of the internet and how things happen. What I like about the Ocean Lotus actors is, like, they have a significant amount of operational security, and they take the time to actually plan out what it is that they're doing. So in a way, like, my call out there, the shout out, was only because there's this mutual respect at some point between defender and offender, right? Defense and offense. It's like that cat and mouse game. These techniques can be applied to really any actor, nation state, crimeware, or even your business for that matter. Mapping out what entities that you have on the internet, what is comprised of your attack surface. But yeah, it's interesting, or was interesting, following these actors, because they often change, and that's kind of interesting to see, because most tend to ignore any sort of public reporting, whereas Ocean Lotus actually leans into it and seems to learn from the mistakes they make.
Good. Brandon, one more for you here. Where do you start your investigation, PassiveTotal or Maltego? What is your normal approach?
Start it by laying down on my office floor. That's how I get all these great ideas. In all seriousness, that is like how some of this investigation did start, but it's typically PassiveTotal first. The Maltego component comes in when I start to realize that I have kind of a ball of yarn sort of a situation, or so much infrastructure that I need to visualize it, because I'm trying to maintain that visual in my head. And that becomes really difficult past a certain amount of indicators of compromise. And so Maltego for me typically comes in once I feel I have an idea of what the infrastructure looks like and I want to accelerate that. And then I can go into Maltego and I'll validate certain assumptions or identify clusters, kind of how Florian demoed. And that'll often drive how I then go back into PassiveTotal and continue the investigation. So it's not a one or the other situation, but often for me, just because I'm used to PassiveTotal, I start there. But I do know some users who may start from a Maltego first, pull in RiskIQ information, and then want to go back to our interface to see, like, more of it in kind of our tabular based view.
Got it. Thanks, Brandon. Florian, Steffen, for those who are not as familiar with Maltego, what's the best way to learn Maltego? And are there any tutorials or other training options available?
Yeah, sure. So there are, especially for our community, there are a lot of free resources available that you can consume. So let me highlight two of them. One of them is our Maltego blog, where we almost daily to offer new insights on what you can do with Maltego and how you can investigate, for example, phishing attacks in Maltego. That's a very good resource to learn Maltego. The second thing is we do have an essentials video series, which basically gives you all of the tools within Maltego that you understand which buttons you need to click. And then we also do have a more advanced on-demand course on Maltego. which is also online and currently accessible also for free. Which is also, if you actually are working in enterprise and you want to go with Maltego on a larger scale deployment, we also do offer everything from 3-hour trainings up to 2-day or 4-day trainings. So there is a lot that our training team can show you on Maltego.
Awesome, lots of options. And one more question for you. Does Maltego offer API integrations and or white labeling?
So API. Go ahead, Steffen. Sorry.
Oh, thank you so much. With regards to API integrations, I'm not sure in what direction that question is aimed at. But so Maltego can integrate with, as already mentioned, over 50 data partners already. And if any of these data partners or any of the data sources that you would like to have integrated with is not yet on Maltego, you can also write your own transforms and host them internally. So you can also consume, if you want to, internal APIs or data, as well as any external APIs. On the other way, if you actually want to export data from Maltego, Maltego does have a lot of options to export these Maltego graphs to XML, CSV, etc. But there is no direct API exporting functionality from Maltego. I hope that does answer the question.
Yeah, it does. Perfect. Thank you. And finally, I think we have one more time for one more question specific to the Ocean Lotus research. Are certificate pivots correlations unique to Ocean Lotus, or are you seeing them more commonly across actor groups?
I don't know about that. Well, I think common-wise, we've seen an increase over the years in SSL certificates being a way to correlate actor infrastructure. I can recall Russian actor several years ago, back when like SSL certificates really weren't leveraged at all, as being a good correlation point. So I'd say like it really depends on the command and control infrastructure and how the actor operates. But yeah, I'd say at this point, SSL certificates are largely deployed on any website. So Google Chrome, really calls most browsers at this point call out websites without an SSL certificate. So it's common to see it employed in phishing websites or infrastructure used for compromise attacks or command and control. The use of self-signed certificates tends to be a bit more specific, often to the back-end systems of what the actors are using. But yeah, I think it's a correlation point that's certainly increased in popularity, and I would anticipate it being yet another way to find overlap when passive DNS or data sets like WHOIS, which are less valuable because of regulation or policy changes like GDPR. I think SSL certificates help fill that spot.
Great. Thanks, Brandon. Well, that's all the time we have questions for today. We'll follow up directly with those who asked questions we weren't able to get to live. And you can see it on the slide here. You can always reach out to success@riskiq.net and support@maltego.com with any additional questions. Thank you, Brandon, Steffen, and Florian for a great webinar. And thank you all for attending. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.